Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Red Menace. For this month's episode, we're going to be covering current events. Last month, we did Critique of the Gotha program. Next month, we're going to do a discussion, I think, on the Communist Manifesto. But every other month, we focus in on current events, and there are a lot of current events happening right now. For some of you may have heard my sort of initial episode, America is on Fire from Rev Left. We also posted it for our patrons on Red Menace as well, so they could have as easy access to it as possible, in which it was really the thick of the moment, and I was, hopefully giving voice and relating to a lot of people's emotive feelings about what's going on, as well as their intellectual ones. And so if you haven't heard that and want to hear the sort of in the heat of the moment examination of what was happening, I would recommend people check that out. We have a lot of stuff to cover today. And so we're going to be kind of jumping over to big topic, but we thought that the best way maybe to start this episode just for our Red Menace audience is to sort of catch up with a sort of bird's eye summary of what's happened thus far and where we are in this moment, as sort of a prelude to our overall discussion today. So Alyson, if you're ready for that, you want to just kind of give a summary of what's happened so far?
Yeah, so, we are obviously recording this in a really wild time to be talking about current events on the whole. So, as people know, the killing of George Floyd led to incredible amounts of uprisings throughout the United States. And over the last several weeks, what we've seen really is spontaneous uprisings that have been particularly militant in terms of their list of demands and their tactics. And that obviously has looked like things like a police precinct in Minneapolis being burnt down by the masses, and demands for the abolition and defunding of the police sort of entering the mainstream, as we're currently looking at people not just talking about reform to the police, but broad systemic and structural changes to how policing in America operates. And so it's a really interesting time to kind of try to do this discussion, because there are such broad demands that we never really could have imagined seeing in mainstream American politics before coming to the forefront here. And there are just an incredible amount of people who have consistently been taking to the street in order to articulate these demands. And we've done, again, some work individually or on our Patreon episodes addressing that. But now we kind of want to get into where we're at today as we move into, the second week of June, and we sort of are seeing what developments are happening here as protests are continuing and demands are starting to get articulated in different ways, and things are perhaps maybe becoming a little bit more concrete in a way that we can analyze closely.
Yeah, definitely. And do you have a starting point, Alyson, in mind for where we can launch off from?
Yeah, I figured we could talk about some of the cities that have interesting actions going on right now. So Seattle maybe is one that we could start with fairly easily. So for people who have not seen what's going on in Seattle, the Capitol Hill area of Seattle had been seeing pretty intense protests and police violence. That's where some footage of CNN crews getting tear gassed had come out of, and police just constantly deploying less lethal weaponry. And after, a good week of a standoff between very, very large crowds and the police abandoned the area and abandoned their precinct and sort of just left. And since then, protesters have essentially occupied several block area of Capitol Hill and have declared it the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or Free Capitol Hill. Exactly what that means is a little bit tricky and maybe something we can discuss about, because there aren't very clear official statements being released. There's just a lot of stuff on social media, but it appears that there's an autonomous zone in Seattle that has some level of armed defense from protesters who have cleared it of police and essentially are governing it themselves to some extent. To what extent that is, we'll obviously have to figure out, but it's a really interesting development, and I think it raises a lot of questions about what struggle looks like and how we take moments like this and turn them into something bigger. So I'm wondering what sort of thoughts you have on the autonomous zone, Brett.
Yeah, overall, I think it's a promising development. I'm still, I'm cautiously optimistic. There are some echoes from what we saw with Occupy when Zuccotti Park was basically taken over. People, put up tents. There were educational forums, medical tents. A little community arose, and after a while of that, the NYPD came in and brutally tore everything to shit, pushed everybody out, etc. Donald Trump right now has been tweeting over the last day or so, losing his mind over the Seattle situation, calling out the quote-unquote radical left Democratic governor and mayor. The mayor shot back with Trump, why don't you go back to your bunker and let us handle it? But while the ruling elite are sort of figuring out what to do about this, I do think that an inevitable crackdown is going to come, but the fact that makes this different than Occupy is the fact that there is armed, left-wing radicals basically securing the perimeter, making sure nobody gets in that they don't want to come in. Barricades have been put up so that vehicles aren't allowed into the autonomous zone. And that is really, I really do believe that's an advancement from what we saw in Occupy, and a very interesting one, but also a dangerous one. It raises the stakes. But I totally sort of appreciate and defend the overall attempt to secure an autonomous zone. And while online you might see some sectarian rifts starting to develop over people's ideas about how things should go, the fact is any movement in the direction of taking areas over, allowing for communities to, basically take over areas and declare them autonomous. The fact that the East Precinct for the Seattle PD is in the autonomous zone has completely been taken over. There is talk on social media about turning that into a community center. I mean, that's really an advancement from things that we've seen before with regards to Occupy and whatnot. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I am waiting for the other foot to fall. When there is pressure applied by the agents of the state to crush this autonomous zone, how will the armed defenders react? How will the overall community react? That is yet to be seen. But the fact that Trump is losing his mind over it, the fact that the state and the far right really hate it, fascists are on Reddit trying to think of ways to infiltrate and sow seeds of chaos and division within the autonomous zone itself. So of course, the moment that people do this, there will be that right-wing reaction. And then there's also the situation, and this is the last thing I'll say on it, about, what do we do with this land? Let's say it really is an autonomous zone that goes uncontested. I saw my comrades from the Indigenous Anarchist Federation say this can't just be a playground for white activists. There has to be some sort of decolonial spine to this autonomous zone. There has to be a giving back of the land or a recapturing of the land by Indigenous peoples and by Black people. And so that contradiction, I think, will continue to play out. I have seen promising things. I've seen, Black speakers and Indigenous speakers really leading that autonomous zone. So this is by no means sort of a way to discredit or diss it. Not at all. I think for the most part, this idea is being taken seriously, but it is in such the early days. We haven't seen the backlash yet. So many questions remained unanswered. But the general idea of taking over a position in a community, having the masses control and defend it with arms, is a beautiful idea, and it doesn't need to be sectarian. I mean, you can talk about red bases in the Maoist tradition. You can talk about dual power in a Leninist formation. You can talk about anarchists and communization theory. All of it sort of is at play here. And if you go through that autonomous zone and ask people their politics, I bet you'd get a wide swath of left-wing ideologies and perspectives. So I think the over-sectarianizing of this is really unnecessary and really just a product of people being online and having ideas about the world without really getting their hands dirty trying to change it. And that will always be a problem with online banter when it comes to these things. But those are sort of my initial thoughts. Again, this shit's in its early development. How about you, Alyson?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that it's tricky, right? I think Marxists have had really mixed response to this, and I think the sectarianism that you get at is one aspect of it. But the thing that I've sort of been thinking about in the context of this is I fully expect this will be crushed by the state. That seems very likely. Historically, we know that that is how these sort of things are responded to. But it's a type of escalation that we just have not seen in American protesting. And that, I think is worthwhile to consider. And I think in terms of your comparisons to Occupy, you're right, that there's an armed defense here. But also what's different than Occupy is it's not occupying a park, it's occupying a neighborhood, and there's a very clear sort of escalation about claiming territory that's going on there that I think is really interesting and worthy of, at the very least, some amount of critical support, because it does raise the temperature in terms of tactics. I think that, how this is all going to play out will probably be fairly tragic, would be my guess. But at the same time, there's lessons that I think will be learned from that are sort of important. The way that I keep looking at it is that, sometimes it is these radical experiments like this and the ways they fail that can teach the movement quite a bit. And, Mao, you see this over and over again in his ideas, that it is through social practice, it is through struggle that we learn lessons. And oftentimes failure is the key way that we learn lessons. So my main hope going forward is if if this does go badly, if this does end up getting, defeated and end up going in a negative direction, that we're not going to just throw it away and not try to learn anything from the experience, but that we can ask questions about what caused it to go in that direction and how in future projects we can take it in a more positive development. I think that at the end of the day, right, there's already theory that talks about this, but a lot of people aren't going to read that theory. But this gives us a moment on the ground for the movement to learn things concretely. And my really big hope is just that this will be a learning moment for us and a takeaway, regardless of how it goes. We will probably learn lessons about spontaneity and horizontalism and armed defense from this that we could have had theoretical discussions about, but we wouldn't have had the concrete, practical, and proximal examples to really ground it in. And I think this will probably give us that. So my hope is that we can at least be productive about it. There will be a time probably for retrospective criticism, but that needs to be geared towards making future actions more successful, not just shitting on anarchists, is sort of my perspective.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. Like right now when everybody is fighting against the same sort of forces, I think it's a time for solidarity, for a realizing of, in this moment, what are the antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions? We come back to that, but it's important to think through. And overemphasizing sectarian differences at this moment, I just think is unhelpful. Always keep your mind open. Always realize that this is an ongoing experiment. Always have things to learn. Always be humble in the face of new developments. But I just don't think this is the time to really be overemphasizing our differences. See what happens and learn from it. And the fact that this does have this armed defense component will be very, as Alyson alluded to, very instrumental and educational with regards to when the backlash does come. What will the armed defense do? Will it just completely collapse immediately? Will there be some sort of shootouts or fights? Like, whatever happens, we'll learn a lot from that. And this is an escalation over time. You can see it in Occupy. You can see it in previous instances going way back in history. You can see it a little bit in Standing Rock when, real community it was in the middle of nowhere, right? Because it was fighting a pipeline, but real community started sprouting up, and there was this attempt to take over and have a community ran sort of area here. The police obviously brutalized that as well. But with each instantiation of this idea of like taking back land, taking over space, and letting the community control it, it raises the stakes with our enemies. It gives us new experiments to run, and it gives us new lessons that we can take to the next instance of this. And I think that speaks to the broader point about all of this, which in the very first heady days of this development, I was myself unsure. Is this going full revolution? Is this just a rebellion that will stop after a day? Where exactly is this going? And it's becoming increasingly clear as time goes on that this is a moment, right? It's not the beginning of a revolution, but it's certainly a drawing of lines that needed to be drawn, of experimentations playing out, of a display of just how much resources in this society is dedicated to funneling into police departments, their salaries, their riot gear, their vehicles, while people get $1,200 for a pandemic check and 1/4 of Americans have no employment right now. And so in a lot of ways, this is not only a result of the contradictions of society, but a further unmasking of them. And so while this might not be the beginnings of a revolution, this is certainly, and I think in retrospect, we'll see this as a defining moment in the overall struggle that will, have really clarified lines, made people pick a side, and then things will develop off of this. And I think that's a healthier way to sort of look at it,
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, the comparison that I keep making is that this, to me, if we're drawing historical analogies, feels like a 1905 kind of situation in a lot of ways. Because I think that what was interesting in 1905 is that it was a wake-up call for the Marxist left, because they had not been involved in organizing a lot of the spontaneous rebellions in 1905. And it was sort of a wake-up call to how powerful the Soviets that were forming at that time could be, and how angry the workers are. And I feel a very similar thing is happening in the United States right now, where I think for me and for a lot of comrades that I've talked to, when these spontaneous uprisings started, when the police precinct got burned, it was sort of like, holy shit, we are a lot less developed as a movement than some of the masses are. We are actually very far behind in a lot of ways that we need to wrestle with. And really the vibe that I get is that this is a moment that should be a wake-up call for us on the left, that there is consciousness, there is anger, there is rage, and that all of those things are present in the masses, and that the masses are in a lot of ways longing for very intense demands, right? The fact that we're seeing colonized people rallying behind discussions of abolition tells us something, and it's really time for the left to wake up and stop tailing that and instead figure out how to become become involved in that movement and take on a position of guidance to push it towards broader structural critique beyond just the police themselves. But I do feel like this is very much a moment where it's sort of like, wow, we were caught off guard, and now we see how unprepared we have been, and hopefully we can experiment and learn the tactics that we're going to need to in order to be more prepared moving forward.
Yeah, exactly. I had a friend reach out to me and ask me, is this call to abolish the police, are we getting ahead of the masses? And I just pointed it out to them, like, no, actually the call comes from the masses. Like, if anything, the organized or official left or whatever is sort of playing keep up in a lot of ways, and that is a very educational process. But no, we are not overextending or going ahead of the masses by declaring the abolition of police as our core demand and our core ideological perspective on this issue. We're actually trailing them. The demand comes organically out of the people, and it's our job to organize that demand into something that can actually be put forward. Because what we are seeing, and this might seem sort of cliche for a Marxist to say, but I mean it's worth constantly saying, is that only more organization can take us further. Spontaneity, and we've talked about this a million times in theory and in current events on the show, it's beautiful and it's so educational, but it also has its inherent limitations. And we're starting to see throughout these protests the systematic co-opting and the narrative shift and the ways that peaceful reconciliation protests with police are highlighted, instead of other more radical demands. But we must remember that in Minneapolis, and I think we'll get to what it really means to abolish the police, but the city council have been basically pushed in this position of saying, yeah, we're willing to dismantle our entire police department. And that did not come by singing with cops and taking pictures and doing dances with cops and kneeling with cops. It came from chasing the pigs out of the department and burning it to the fucking ground. And that sort of radical activity is what gets the goods, but at the same time, because it's so unorganized and it's so spontaneous, every single interest group and perspective can come in and emphasize what they want to emphasize. We see corporations now putting statement after statement about how they stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, to the point where a lot of black radicals are now thinking that Black Lives Matter as a rhetorical device needs to be moved away from, because that's already been co-opted by the corporations, by the Democratic liberals, etc. And maybe it needs to be replaced with something more robust, like Black Power, something that isn't an asking of the power structure to care about Black lives, but a demanding of self-determination, and how that can be not as easily co-opted. Can you imagine corporations trying to run with Black Power instead of Black Lives Matter? It's very different dynamic there, and it draws on a very different radical history. And so all of this stuff is coming to the forefront. But what I'm seeing now is so much of it being funneled back into the maintenance of the system, into mere reforms. And I think when we think about what this is, when we think about the fact that history constantly repeats itself, like, holy shit, this shit was going on in the 60s and now it's happening all over again, right? Well, why is that? That's because the fundamental underlying structures of colonialism and capitalism are still in place. So as long as those overarching structures stay, grounded and stay active, and all you do is reform around the edges, well, those reforms can easily be retracted and the underlying problems never get solved. So if we really want to get beyond the cycles of uprising and being pacified, and then uprising and being pacified, and really move to a new era, it will have to be a revolutionary rupture from the underlying structure. It can't merely be reformism. And I think we're learning that lesson in real time as well.
Yeah, and I think, we can maybe talk a little bit about the situation in Minneapolis as an example of where these things are sort of cropping up. So there were kind of two big developments in Minneapolis politics. So the first was the mayor, what is his name, Jacob Frey or Justin Frey?
I think it's Jacob, yeah.
Yeah, something Frey, Jacob Frey maybe. He showed up at a protest being held and, got the mic and started saying, like, I recognize my complicity in this. I understand that we need to do better. We need to, control cops. And a protester just straight up asked him, yes or no, do you support defunding the police? And he said, no, I don't support abolition, and was booed out of the protest.
The most awkward walk of shame ever.
Right. It was really incredible to see, right? And so in the wake of that, and that obvious public humiliation, the 9 members of the Minneapolis City Council ended up agreeing and signing a pledge to defund and get rid of the police department in Minneapolis. And that has had a lot of interesting responses, from excitement to skepticism towards it. And I think it actually works as potentially a case study in terms of what co-option looks like and the ambiguity about demands and languages here. So one thing that I think people, question right away is, okay, well, if you get rid of the police department, what are you going to replace it with? It is not just enough to get rid of it. We have to know what sort of comes after. And healthy skepticism might be justified in this case, as one of the city council members took to Twitter to basically clarify, like, oh, when I talk about abolition, I mean getting rid of policing as we know it, and we're going to get rid of the department, but we'll also work with the police chief to set something new up that will replace it. And obviously, that's not what people were demanding. That's not what the call was for. And that shows, I think, a way in which liberals will kind of take the language of abolition or defunding and they'll twist it however they want. But also, in terms of the question of reform not being enough, interestingly, the city council kind of pushes up against the question about whether or not reform is possible whatsoever. Because some people started doing some digging into the city codes, and it doesn't look like the city council has the jurisdiction to remove the police department. They would need the help of the mayor, along with judicial oversight based on how the bureaucratic code is currently written. So we have this pledge that already looks like it's softening in terms of what it concretely means, but also we're realizing that the way the bourgeois state is set up is that it has provisions in place that are meant to make these kind of systemic changes impossible in the first place. So, I would like to remain hopeful that we will see the end of the police department in Minneapolis, but what that looks like and whether that's possible are all kind of being called into question, and we're seeing some of the difficulties with demands for reforms from the bourgeois state right now.
And I think as long as you keep the underlying causes of crime present, there will be lots of people, for better or worse, that think, well, we do need the police. And so, part of the defunding of the police or abolishing the police pragmatically, step by step, needs to include a reinvestment in the root causes of crime: poverty, desperation, lack of opportunity, healthcare, education, housing, all the things that we talk about for a just society. They need to be brought in simultaneously with this call to defund or abolish the police. And what we're going to see, because we're living through an economic crisis because of the pandemic, as we come out of this pandemic, we're already seeing calls right now, even by Blue Dog Democrats put out a statement recently, I think just yesterday, saying Democrats need to take seriously the debt, the national debt. So what that means is that they're setting us up for another round of austerity coming out of this pandemic and economic crisis. Now, I do think that insofar as we want to, pursue certain reforms, that we could use this austerity moment to say, okay, now take money not away from Social Security or healthcare or education, take it away from the police and the military and put it into these other things. But then again, once you do that, you're fighting the entire ruling class. And are we going to be able to keep up the momentum and pressure on the streets needed to force the politicians into a position locally, right, in all these different localities? Because policing really is locally controlled. It's not like, it's not really federally controlled in the way that you can just push one bill in the federal level and get it all taken care of. It's going to be a constant on the ground local movements putting pressure on these things. But I don't know exactly where this is going, but we know that austerity is coming, and we know Democrats and Republicans are really not going to be looking to defund the police as they defund the things necessary to keep crime down, like people's access to jobs, healthcare, etc. So we're in this precarious moment. There is an opportunity for reform, but seeing how these things are being co-opted, how they're being dissipated, how the overall morale is being demoralized, given the lack of organization and coherent focus and structure needed to push this movement to the next level, I think we're going to see a lot of struggles coming up, and it's going to be a lot harder than it is just to declare these things, to actually see them through. And again, I think this is why we need revolutionary ruptures from the overall system, and not an incessant refunneling of this revolutionary energy back into the blunting of the knife in all of our backs, right?
Right. And I think that what's going to be particularly important for Marxists in this time is to be able to have the explanation for why we're seeing these troubles, right? What is going to happen with these demands is that they are going to run into co-option. They are going to run into these limits. I think you raised a really good point, Brett, that just the federal government can only do so much. The way that the political system in the United States is set up is such that it's already kind of internally balkanized in a way, where making coherent national level decisions is nearly impossible. And we're going to see the structural limits of the state. And I think it's important, Marxists might be tempted to handle this in two ways. I've already seen some Marxists who say, like, look, all of this means that abolition is impossible, therefore we shouldn't call for abolition. And I think that that would be a naive mistake, even if in a sense abolition is impossible under, bourgeois rule. But I think the more important thing is to be able to show these limits of abolition being demanded under bourgeois rule and say, look, if it's the case that the bourgeois state cannot achieve abolition, then maybe the things that we need to be demanding are be abolished are much broader than just the police, right? Maybe this connects to a broader problem of class rule on the whole. And I think that that really is where it's going to be important. Because you're right, that people, when they hear about the idea of getting rid of the police, they want to know, well, how are we going to deal with crime? And one of the real answers to that has been developed in abolitionist theory is, well, we need to address the root causes of crime. But so long as class society exists, so long as we are living under a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, those fundamental contradictions can't be fully addressed. And so we're going to find the limits of what reformist demands are here. And it's important that Marxists not be dismissive in noting those limits, but explain why that means that these demands need to be repackaged in an actually radical and communist direction that takes into account, sort of the broader need for a revolutionary rupture and for change that's not just achieved through pressuring independent Democrats. I think that, we're in a cool place, right? Because people are winning demands. And that's something that we haven't experienced, I think, in a long time. Looking here at Los Angeles, even, we had protesters started demanding the curfew would be gotten rid of and that amnesty would be given to those who were arrested. And then we got both of those things. The curfew got lifted and the attorney general does not look like they're going to be pushing charges against protesters. So it's cool to be able to win these demands. And that's a very empowering thing that I don't think that we get to experience a lot. But at the same time, I think it's very important that we recognize that that can only get us so far, and we need to have a broader analysis that ties this to capitalism and to settler colonialism specifically as producing the social antagonisms that we're trying to wrestle with.
Totally. Yeah, and if we accept that this is a moment and not a revolution, this is more 1905 than 1917, that's fine. And, to push even more weight behind Alyson's point about not being dismissive but being explanatory and educational, we see that the leading edge of these rebellions and these uprisings are really youth-led. And so, I'm in my early 30s, right? So I'm already pretty old in regards to, young people, right? I'm already like a generation ahead of what's considered very young, the people that are literally in their late teen years or early 20s, engaged in this for the first time. People that, were born right before or during the Obama administration have come of age in a hellish dystopia and are learning these things on the ground for the first time. So when we say that we have to point out the limitations of reformism, we do that because a lot of these young folks are learning for the first time on the ground. They need older people with more organizing experience, more understanding of the system, more political theory to guide them and say, hey, you see how this works? This is a direct result from A and B. And give them the sort of intellectual tools they need to understand this moment and then move beyond it in the future. Because the young people right now who we're turning around and educating in 10 years are going to be turning around and educating the next crop of people. And that's an important dynamic that needs to be kept alive. And as Marxists, we know knowledge, understanding is gained through praxis, right? Through interacting with the subject at hand and learning through doing. And so, you can't sit back and just think about things and come to a conclusion that can overturn the system. You need to get your hands dirty and learn lessons by doing. And a lot of the young people are doing that, and they're looking for leadership. And so when the initial thrust of this movement sort of dissipates, liberals go back into their corner, radicals go back into their corner. What the radicals need to do is continue political education, continue organizing on the ground to facilitate more capacity in the future, in future moments of crises, to move beyond even the limitations of this movement. But we see this movement moving beyond the limitations of things like Occupy and even Ferguson. So we really do see a building up of one on another, and every explosion of the masses, rage and despair at the system does become more mature. It becomes slightly sharper, right? And that's a process that we have to continue to facilitate and build on, not just dismiss as imperfect, therefore we turn away from it.
Right. And I think that it's such an important moment for theory in a certain sense, because if we think about sort of where we as Marxists have been at for quite a while now, we're reading about other people's uprisings and other people's revolutions, right? And we're trying to take takeaways from those. And that's invaluable. We have to study the Russian experience. We have to study the Vietnamese experience. And we have to study the Algerian experience and the Chinese experiences of revolution. But we also haven't been studying necessarily so much the on-the-ground things that are happening here. And I think that oftentimes we seem out of touch to people as Marxists because we're always pointing to this theory that's about a time fairly far in the past for most young people, and also in a totally different context. And it's important, I think, that Marxists are out investigating what's on the ground right now and writing about it, drawing takeaways from it, so that now we have a whole generation who, what I keep coming back to, for the first time have been tear gassed by cops, shot by rubber bullets, who have learned what the brutality of the bourgeois state is, and who are going to look for answers about why things have happened the way they have. And it's important that we're making contemporary analyses of what's going on the ground. It's important that we're there on the front lines taking notes of things, finding the contradictions at play, and being able to analyze those things, because those are the kind of forms of analysis that are going to be interesting to people in a way that a lot of the more historical analysis isn't. And we still need the historical analysis, but we can lead people into that if we're writing good explanations and making good work and connections to explain what's happening now as young people are experiencing it.
Yeah. Absolutely. And just to think over what's happened, just from right now, I think this is June 11th, there's been over a dozen deaths of protesters throughout these uprisings across the country, and over 10,000 arrests, right? So people are being funneled into the prison or the jail system, often for the very first time. A lot of younger people going through that process, having to pay money. Obviously, bail funds are doing a lot of work on this front to make sure people don't have that financial impact on top of the pandemic and economic crisis. But there's lots of things that people are experiencing for the first time that maybe some of us have experienced in the past, but we need to help these people learn it firsthand and develop a sort of understanding of it going forward. And here in Omaha, maybe we could talk about some of the things going on in different cities, as we talked about before recording. Here in Omaha, I'm really proud to say that our organization really spearheaded the bail fund project with regards to getting people out of bail and working with other organizations to get our information out. So as it stands, we've brought in over $120,000 for our bail fund, and we've bailed out over 140 people, right? So everybody that goes into jail in Omaha because they're protesting is bailed out by NLC, and then the funds go to pay their court costs and any fines they have to pay. So anybody arrested in Omaha, they will walk away from this with lumps on their heads and, a horrifying jail experience, but not having to pay a fucking cent. And that's a really beautiful thing and something I'm really proud of here in our community. And also I wanted to talk about the ugly side of our community, because Omaha is also getting a lot of, national coverage because of the James Scurlock case. And I talked about this at the beginning of America is on Fire episode on Rev Left, but James Scurlock was a 22-year-old black protester. And he had a run-in, him and his friends had a run-in with a white supremacist, reactionary, Trump-supporting business owner in downtown Omaha by the name of Jake Gardner. And Jake Gardner had been out in the front of his business threatening people. He had a gun. His older father in his 60s had a gun as well. They were brandishing it towards protesters. There's some credible evidence that Jake Gardner was spewing the N-word, calling white protesters N-word lovers throughout the night, and walked down from his sort of business front to confront protesters way after curfew. Brandished a gun, was intimidating people, threatening people with a gun, pulled it out, actually shot twice in the air. And James Scurlock, seeing his friends being menaced by a white supremacist with the gun, jumped on Jake Gardner's back to disarm him, to save his friends, and Jake Gardner shot him in the neck and killed him. What happened next was police did 3-hour investigation, brought Jake Gardner in, said that he did nothing wrong, even though, by the way, his concealed carry permit had expired. So there was literally a technical law violation of using a gun that was expired with your concealed carry permit to commit a murder, but they let him go with no charges. They decided within a 24-hour period that nothing bad was done, no crime was committed, let him go, at which point he immediately, as far as we know, fled to California. And Jake Gardner here in Omaha has a long history of being transphobic and racist. He runs a business did run a business called The Hive, which was basically like a dance club. And he was notorious for creating dress standards that were clearly meant to keep black people out of his business. So he's been a sort of pariah in our community for a long time. And this all culminated in the death of 22-year-old James Scurlock. And no charges at all, even though the gun he used to kill him with was technically illegal and should never have been on his person in the first place. So this is an example of a governor, of a mayor, of a police force, all conspiring with a business owner and a white supremacist to make sure he faced absolutely no accountability, no justice for the death of a young man that his family is in mourning right now. The city of Omaha is in mourning, and there's a refusal to do anything about it at all. And so while we have optimistic things with the NLC doing a lot to make sure people don't stay in jail, we have this underlying white supremacy and the entire city, state, local government coming together to defend a white supremacist murderer and let him off with no charges. So.
Yeah, no, and I mean, this is something that we are seeing in a lot of ways around the country, right? As the president, the feds, and, the police talk about, left-wing terror right now, we are seeing concrete instances of right-wing terror that are either not being prosecuted or that are being prosecuted very lightly. Similar situation that ended somewhat less tragically, thankfully, in Seattle, where someone had driven a car into a group of protesters, then gotten out and shot somebody, was able to just walk behind police lines and be peacefully arrested, and is only facing assault charges.
Oh my God.
So, just another instance of someone trying to kill someone and facing only an assault charge. We had people brandishing weapons at protests in Eugene and threatening people and facing just very, very light charges as a result of that as well, after being peacefully taken in by the police. And what we're seeing is that the state and the police are backing this white terror, essentially. They are backing this white supremacist right-wing violence and trying to make sure that people face minimal punishment for it. And, it's not to say that, this is hypocritical, because in a sense it isn't, right? The job of the state is to prosecute, resistance and to prop up counter-revolution. That is what it does, and it shouldn't surprise us. But it is also an absolutely horrifying thing that we're seeing right now, and hopefully we can draw attention to the fact that, there is no real distinction between the white supremacists and the police state. They're serving the same function in this country, and that's why we see this kind of collaboration between them, and we see people being able to get away with this white supremacist terror violence with absolute impunity. It shouldn't surprise us, and we should be able to explain why that's the case. And it's just another instance of the material function of the state becoming clearer and clearer in really horrific ways by the day.
Yeah, and it's also worth pointing out that a lot of these cities where police brutality, and we've all seen countless videos, these cities are run by Democratic mayors, Democratic governors. The presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, Joe Biden, has come out with two just remarkably intelligent responses to police brutality. In one case, he called for police to be trained to shoot people in the leg instead of the chest. And then the latest thing, he came out and he, along with Bernie Sanders, it's worth saying, both proposed increasing budgets to police departments amidst calls for defunding them, knowing full well that austerity is coming, and your healthcare and your Social Security and your education and all the basic social programs that help people, those are all getting cut. While Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden call for increasing police budgets, it's absolutely sort of incomprehensible on one level, but then fully comprehensible on another, because we know that these Democrats, as much as liberals like to think it's good guys versus bad guys, it's just two versions of bad guys. And the Democrats put on a slightly more PC woke facade while they brutalize people in the streets and perpetuate the very class inequalities that give rise to the desperation and the racial injustices that give rise to the desperation in the first place, while the far right is just going full fascist, teaming up with white supremacist paramilitary groups and organizations and formations, working with white supremacists. There's videos of cops talking to Proud Boys before they clear out an area in a city, telling them stay out of this area so you don't get, tear gassed and whatnot. And white supremacists, neo-Nazis they've had a conscious strategy. Obviously, this goes back to the entire history of policing in America, which came out of slave patrols, but especially recently, there's been a concerted effort knowing that white supremacists don't have the demographic or numerical ability to really overtake the system. So what they've done instead is infiltrate strategic institutions like the police department so that they can carry out their racial violence, and they can agitate within already reactionary police departments, pushing those police departments further right, and pushing violence on people they deem as subhuman in the first place. So this is a complete understandable connection between the non-institutional far right and the institutional far right, and they're definitely coming together and working together in every city across this nation for a really shared interest, which is the preservation of white supremacy at the very least.
Yeah, no, and in terms of the Democratic complicity, I think there was that statement from Joe Biden that everyone keeps saying perfectly summarizes everything, which is that we should have police shoot people in the leg instead of shooting them in the head or in the heart. And that's sort of the big reform idea, is we'll just make them shoot them somewhere else, which, it does really capture what the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is. Are you going to bleed out from artery in your leg, or are you going to bleed out from your head or heart? That's really about the only difference at the end of the day. And it's just absolutely horrifying to see the fact that there is no real opposition in terms of the state and electoral politics to the very steady and clear creep of fascism, and what we're probably going to see of a really increased state crackdown on left-wing movements and on Black liberation movements in the wake of this. We talked about the crackdown in Seattle, but on the other side of things, I think things are going to crack down nationally as well as a result of this. Trump is humiliated, he is angry, the federal government is angry, and we probably are going to see things move in an ugly direction, and we cannot count on the Democrats to defend people, because they will be more than on board with whatever forms of state violence take place, moving forward.
Yeah, and I think that's a big, reiteration of the fact that if we're going to do the things that everybody listening to the show wants to do, whether you're anarchist, Marxist, or anything else, it's never going to be able to be done through the system itself. Therefore, the only thing left to us is to build power outside of those institutions, not increasingly rely on them and let yourself be funneled back into supporting and reifying the very institutions that create the problems in the first place and are showing every step of the way a refusal to do anything meaningful to stop it. And what the autonomous zone in Seattle, what Standing Rock, what the uprisings overall, what Ferguson, what it all is pointing towards is that if you want real change, it has to be not through the mechanisms of the system, but a direct confrontation with the system, with both parties of the system. And that's going to require building community, building, medical abilities, defense capacities outside of the institutions themselves. And I know a lot of people know that already, but we need to put that into practice more and more. And we need to help other people who might not be as radical as us, who might not have that full structural understanding, to come along and see these things in real time as they play out right in front of their eyes. So it's not some abstract theory, but it's happening all around you. And we're charting out every single step and explaining why this is happening and why that's happening. And that's our role as Marxist, intellectuals, as people who have dedicated our lives to not only, the organizing side of it, but to understanding the theory so that we can guide that organizing in a more efficacious way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the big thing, right, is this focus on taking this crisis and learning things from it and making them last. So we had talked about coronavirus, right, and the COVID pandemic and how mutual aid and all these other forms of organizing are developing. And one thing that I've tried to emphasize over and over again is that needs to become a permanent feature of life. We need to have permanent systems of food distribution, of aid distribution that aren't all we do, because they're not inherently political in and of themselves, but they create an infrastructure of power alongside political organizing that needs to exist. And similarly with these protests, right, a lot of people for the first time realized I can buy food and masks and water and I can distribute them to people and I can help people stay safe during these situations, and I can organize ways that our community can take care of itself while we're out protesting. And those things need to become permanent features of power in the hands of the masses that, in and of themselves, again, are not enough. They need political guidance. They need ideological guidance. But paired with those things, create the real beginnings of actual power outside of the state. And it's making those things into permanent features of our organizing and permanent features of our neighborhoods and our communities and our daily lives that is going to be able to push this forward into a more long-term form of resistance, not just a spontaneous protest. And so we are learning lessons. People are learning skills they hadn't learned before. And It's about creating the organizational structure around those skills.
Yeah, and one more thing I say before we move on, if you want to talk about something else. We talk about infiltration. I talked about this on America on Fire. The ancient provocateurs that are clearly part of the police, these piles of bricks showing up. Some people are more skeptical of that than others. It's clear that white supremacists and people who believe in a second civil war, a race war, are trying to play this up as much as they can. But the infiltration that we often don't think about, and it's often not even conscious infiltration, but it's infiltration of a sort, is an infiltration by people who want to obsess over peace, who want to stress unprincipled unity with the police. And one of the more hilarious examples that have blossomed out of this moment that is educational in and of itself is this group in Atlanta that dressed up basically like the Black Panther Party, were throwing up black fists, right? And initially when these images started coming out, everybody's like, dope, dope, dope. Black Panther Party, they're back, whatever iteration of the Black Panther Party this may be. Turns out that after some investigation, this specific group in Atlanta were actually just Instagram models and actors who basically bought the tactical gear to look like Black Panther Party members, who had makeup done and everything, and then the picture started coming out of them locking arms with police. Now, is this a conscious effort to come in and de-escalate? Is this a psyop of some sort? Maybe, but probably not. These are probably just Instagram influencers, completely narcissistic, devoid of any political theory or guidance whatsoever, wanting to be performative, as is their sort of inclination as influencers and actors and models. But what they end up doing is hurting the overall cause. Every time you see a protester dance with the police officer, lock arms with the pig, it muddies the waters around what we want. It demoralizes the actual revolutionary energy that goes into these protests, and it allows for the co-option and the funneling of these energies into all the wrong places, into a reification of the police as if we need them, as if they're our friends, as if they're going to work together with the community to solve these problems. That's a dead end, and it's infiltration of a sort, conscious or not. And so we also need to be on the lookout for that, for every white, adventurous that wants to, get ahead of the masses in a given moment and break something and have to be called back. There's also, white, black, brown, anything, people on the other side trying to go out of their way to create unprincipled unity with the very forces, the very agencies, the very institutions that are brutalizing people before and during this uprising that continue. I mentioned over 12 deaths. That's just the recent number that I heard. It could be higher by now. But almost all of those deaths during these protests are black people, are black men specifically. So the very problems are continuing to happen as the uprising against the problems is taking place, and you see all these different formations stressing unprincipled unity in this time, which is so fucking damaging overall to the movement, and why we want to obsess about right wing and police provocateurs and infiltrators. We also have to put a stop in our own communities and our protests to this other form of infiltration and de-escalation in the most unprincipled way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we need to call attention very much to that violence that is being enacted by the police in this moment, right? It is this thing that people keep saying where we're seeing protests against police brutality responded to with more police brutality, right? And every time we see these acts of sort of like unification with the police, or we can all be friendly with each other, or these PR stunts of police kneeling, we need to remember that there are people who have lost their eyes in this, right? People have lost eyeballs from being shot with rubber bullets because cops seem to be shooting them straight at people's faces. There are people who've had their skulls fractured. There are people who are facing serious charges as a result of this. The FBI has arrested activists in St. Louis, for example, around some of the protests already. We are already seeing terrible suffering happening as a result of the police action right now. And every time we see these stunts, we need to call attention back to that violence that is being done. And it's not even people dying, right? And, like a content warning heads up here for a discussion of sexual assault from police, because this is a consistent problem. But in one of the testimonies that a USC student who was arrested by LAPD discussed, she said that her and a bunch of other women were loaded onto a bus in cages, had their genitals searched multiple times by LAPD, and then when people started having panic attacks to drown them out, had deafening heavy metal played on the speakers inside the bus so the cops couldn't hear them. And this is sexual torture and psychological torture that this person is reporting from the police. And this is the reality of what's going on. And it's that we need to think think about. And it is incredibly disrespectful to these people who have put their safety on the line and ended up arrested when we allow opportunists to pull us back towards peace with the police, or some sort of idea that they're not all bad, or, some of them want to take a knee with us. Because after they're done taking a knee, it's that kind of torture that they're engaging in.
Yeah, and you mentioned the heavy metal music as a sort of psychological torture. Where does that come from? That comes specifically out of the Iraq War, right?
Yeah, and so that is something that we used against terrorists overseas.
Yeah, they literally would put them into semi-trailers or something like that, and just blast music 24 hours, no light, so you can't tell if it's day or night. And that's a form of psychological torture. And so we see what's being used against innocent people abroad by the U.S. imperialist machine being brought home and used against U.S. citizens, not only in the strategies and that form of terror, but the personnel. Often veterans come in and fill up police forces, and the supplies. So military surplus, things that the military has a new budget this year, they can buy newer versions, and all that excess gets funneled down into the police. So psychologically, you have veterans coming from fighting overseas wars and American imperialism, taking that the enemy is amongst us mentality to the streets of America with the equipment and the strategies used to fuck people up, abroad. And so you really are seeing the imperialist death machine start to devour its own tail. Now, for indigenous black people, they've always been victims of imperialism within the border. They've always been colonies within a nation within a nation. But now it's being really distributed on large, wide scales, like really never before seen. And while Obama did a little bit trying to stop the selling of surplus military to police departments, Trump came in and just undid that. So even the minor things that Obama did that were good were immediately retracted when a right-wing government comes in and just draws back every even little tiny, scintilla of reform that the previous administration did. And this is another reason why reform in and of itself is utterly insufficient, because amongst all the other problems with it, it is always subject to recall. And so even the 60s, the civil rights, so much, the Great Society, all these reforms came out of the civil rights movement in the 60s, and have since then been systematically deconstructed and dismantled by, the executive branch, the Supreme Court, local officials on the ground, the Reagan era, all of it. The third wave Democrats throughout the 90s were a huge part of this problem. Bill Clinton himself, time after time after time, would do these police bills where it'd be like, we're putting 100,000 new police on the street. 2 years later, we're putting 200,000 new police officers on the street. So this is, this is both parties. And to think that the Democrats are going to be the mechanism by which we get out of this is absolutely just bonkers. It's just like you are untethered from reality if you think the Democrats are your friends here.
Right. No, absolutely.
One more thing, Alyson, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But I thought of this when you were talking, and I just read this right before I came in, and it's just another example of everything we're talking about. But in Iowa, Des Moines has actually been popping off pretty strongly for a Midwestern, relatively small city. Des Moines is, pretty small compared to, it's much smaller than even Omaha, but has had huge protests. And I just found out that one of the organizers in Iowa got arrested for protesting, right? He's a lead organizer, a black man, I think a student aged, so early 20s, black man. And he was arrested, and the judge in that case decided that he wasn't available to get bail. There's no bail available to him because he had a prior weed charge. So the judge uses a prior marijuana charge to make sure that he can't get bailed out with the bail funds in that city. And so he's sitting in jail at the same time. In Minneapolis, one of the 4 pigs that killed George Floyd is released on bail. So taking part in a murder on video, and he's allowed to get bail. But because you're organizing a protest and have a prior marijuana arrest, you don't even get an access to bail, so that bail fund can't help that individual. And of course, it's racialized too, but it's just worth pointing out. I just saw that coming in. So I'm going to keep up on that story and hopefully provide updates in the future. But keep an eye on that as well.
Yeah, that's horrifying, honestly. And, in the context of Minneapolis, too, the thing with that officer, too, is that they crowdsourced the money, which is sort of another horrifying aspect, is that there were people willing to pay the $750,000 of bail through crowdsourcing. And I think it does speak to the fact that, the masses on the whole, we are seeing, especially the colonized masses, rising up in a progressive direction right now. But there are reactionary people out there willing to throw their money behind counter-revolution and behind police murder. And we're seeing that very explicitly in that officer being able to get his bail at all.
Absolutely. Is there anything else that we haven't covered on your notes?
I think that really gets to most of it. Outside of the protests, I wanted to talk about coronavirus briefly.
Yeah.
and sort of what's going on there, because I think that that might end up playing into how the state is going to justify repression of these protests even further. So one thing that I think is worth considering, it's kind of interesting. I feel like I had forgotten about coronavirus for a little bit,
right.
And I suspect that other people had as well, because all of a sudden we're dealing with a national uprising, and the virus no longer is the thing that's necessarily on the top of your head. But coronavirus is still there. The crisis is still going. All its economic and health effects are still going, and states are still continuing to open up. But one thing that we are seeing is that, a second wave might be developing right now. Bloomberg, in their piece they put out today, basically says that there is a second wave, and some of the data indicates that we may be looking at that. Most states now are seeing a spike that is as big as what we were seeing in the beginning of May, which would seem to indicate that some of the social distancing effects that had reduced the numbers are not continuing, and that we might be looking at a very high level of infection again. States like Arizona in particular are looking at very big numbers in new cases, and hospitals are already preparing to get overwhelmed a little bit. So one thing that we should be thinking about is that, the crisis around COVID is still here. It's something that still needs to be organized around. It's something that probably is going to get very acute in the next month, but also probably something that is going to be used to justify cracking down on these protests, right? The narrative that's going to come out of the state and the right wing is going to be that this second wave is because of these protests. We already saw this on Fox News with one of Fox News' hosts basically saying, if there's a second wave, you can blame it on the left. And obviously, that is ridiculous, given that it's the right who was protesting to reopen the economy and, started having protests around trivial things like getting haircuts. But I do think there is going to be sort of, if this second wave emerges, a justification of public safety as a need to crack down on these protests. And it's just one thing I think we should be aware of and prepare ourselves for, and think about how we're going to deal with and continue responding to the COVID crisis, which may indeed be spiking again, and how we're going to need to deflect blame away in terms of propaganda, in terms of public-facing ideas, away from protesters who are taking to the streets demanding justice and are putting themselves at risk, yes, but that's an admirable thing. And I think we just need to be prepared to deal with that narrative somewhat.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out, at least in my experience and things I've seen videos from other cities, but, in the many protests that I've been in just in the last few weeks, the people on the ground are really taking seriously at least the use of masks, right? Like even in a context where there's an uprising, because it's a predominantly left-wing uprising, people are going to take the science and medical experts seriously, even in the midst of fighting for their human rights. And so you see everybody in a Black Lives Matter protest with thousands of people out on the streets, 98% of people have some sort of face covering. Whereas, in the right, when they're doing their protests, it was a point to not wear a mask, and it's continuing to be that. And then they're cynically blaming the left for this disruption, even though we saw white spring breakers and everything beforehand. We don't care, it's just all part of the thing. But the moment they can use this pandemic for their own political ends, they will. And Alyson's completely right. We need to be aware of that. And I just want to point out, and I pointed this out elsewhere, but it's really important to remember this, that the pandemic hit America, and it was Black and brown communities that were disproportionately affected by the pandemic itself. And then what happened? The economic crisis happened, a subsequent economic collapse due to the pandemic. And it was Black people, indigenous people that disproportionately bore the blunt of that crisis. And then in the midst of all of that, as there's disproportionate economic and health results for communities of color, there is the police state doesn't even take a break. There's not even a pause on the police state. And Black people are the ones disproportionately being murdered by the police state before and then during the protest against police brutality. And so on every single level, it's really the communities of color bearing the overwhelming brunt of these multiple crises on top of crises. And, that's just something worth keeping in mind and showing how it's the communities of color and Black people and indigenous people, but Black people specifically, who really are suffering the most on all fronts right now. And that suffering, if we leave it in the hands of the system, is only going to increase in the wake of this pandemic, in the wake of this economic collapse, when austerity is introduced and social programs that are keeping a few people's heads above water right now are eradicated in the name of bringing down the national debt.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we need to point out, too, is that the police state is making the virus worse, right, in the context of these protests. One thing, again, protesters are going to get blamed for this, but how many of these cops are not wearing masks until the tear gas comes out, right? I've seen so many cops at this who are not wearing masks or taking social distancing practices themselves. But also, we need to think about how the crowd control tactics being used by cops make virus transmission worse. When you kettle a crowd, you pack them together, right, which, makes it more dangerous in terms of transmission. ammunition. But then on top of that, the main crowd control weapons being used are chemical weapons that attack the respiratory system and cause coughing. And they're being launched into crowds that are being kettled and pushed together. So if there is a spike in cases that comes from these protests, we're going to need to be able to point out the way that is the police actions that are making safety at these protests impossible through using tear gas, through using pepper spray and other things that cause you to cough and run away into crowded places of people, and that the virus is being provoked very directly by action that the police are taking as well. So don't let that narrative shift completely. I think it's very important that we pull back and show how it is the police repression itself that is creating the danger of the virus at these protests.
And to add another dimension onto that, there's the kettling, but there's also the jailing. So when you do mass arrests, you push people into, a lot of times, because in mass arrests, you can't get everybody directly to the department individually. You put them all into buses or some sort of holding thing before you can check them in, and then they're put into cells next to people. And then on top of that, when these police are shooting rubber bullets, which is a war crime, and gassing their own people, shooting tear canisters at people's heads, blood starts flying everywhere. People have to run in, pick up an injured person in Seattle right before the autonomous zone was declared, I think. A 21-year-old was hit, a woman hit right in the chest with a tear gas canister from like 30 yards out, and immediately collapsed, and a bunch of people had to run in, and then the cops tear gassed the entire street. So just depravity stacked on top of depravity. And the cops, if they really cared about the pandemic, could be doing things in a way that would at least sort of decrease that, but that's not what they're concerned about. They actually want to terrorize people, and if the pandemic assists them in their terrorizing of these people, they will absolutely play into that as well, and we're seeing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
The whole world is coming out like. I think because we're so locked into what's happening nationally with our politics, we can also often lose sight of the rest of the world. But there's an Australian news crew who was brutalized in one of these protests, and there's a minor sort of international incident that stemmed out of that, where Australia was fucking pissed that the U.S. was doing that to their journalists on the ground. There's been major protests all across the world in several major cities. I mean, completely swarmed out. Cities in like London, Berlin, Paris, around the world, tens of thousands of people coming out in solidarity, condemnations from places like China and other countries around the world against America's just blatant, in front of everybody, human rights violations. A lot of the things that police are doing to domestic citizens aren't even allowed in situations of war. They're considered war crime by the Geneva Convention, and police are unleashing it on their own people. And so the world is watching. I've talked about the imperialist implications of this on America's on Fire episode. But just the whole world seeing what America is really about, the mask of America coming off, and for the first time in a long time, America being the country that all the other countries are pointing to and saying that's a human rights violation. Of course, their allies aren't going to be too vocal about it. You see Trudeau really trying to tiptoe around every fucking thing like the coward that he is. But China's coming out pretty hard, just emphasizing this stuff. And the people, the masses in other countries, regardless of what their governments are doing, the people see it, and the whole world really is watching and is on the side of the protesters here. And we can at least gain some international sense of solidarity out of that beautiful sort of solidarity across borders and time. That's a positive in all of this, and it's also one of our advantages as well.
Yeah, no, and I think we have to focus on those positives to some extent because, it's just hard to wrap your mind around the scope of what is happening. There's so much good news and bad news every day. And I think, we as the left are used to defeat. I think we have a tragic sensibility overall based on our history. And I think it is important to look at those positive things that are happening now and really think about the possibility being opened up and, feeling hope, which is a scary thing to let yourself feel sometimes. But I think there's a lot to be hopeful here. We are really seeing the mainstreaming of ideas that just never could have been mainstream before. And it's not by watering them down, and it's not by appealing to liberalism. It's by people really taking to the streets and fighting back. And I think, there's just a lot to really be optimistic about. And it's important that we focus in on that, especially, I think, as state repression will probably get worse. We have to maintain that optimistic spirit.
Absolutely. And as I said earlier, lines have been drawn. So what happens the next time? Because this is not going to stop. What happens the next time a cop is caught on camera murdering an unarmed black person? Well, the people, the masses, the colonized people specifically have already risen up and said, No, you moved your chess piece. This is our chess piece. Fuck you. And so do it again. See what happens. And this is how these things are going to continue to evolve, because without revolutionary rupture from the system will continue to produce the same results it's produced for its entire existence. And people are now, having drawn the line here, are going to have to react in the future when it inevitably happens again. And more and more people are coming over. I was listening to Ta-Nehisi Coates on Ezra Klein's podcast, and Ta-Nehisi, liberal, progressive, whatever. But he was talking about a conversation he had with his father, who was a black man alive during the 60s uprisings. And he said, what's fundamentally different this time around from the 1960s? And Ta-Nehisi Coates' father said, in the 60s, it was like black people in black communities, and they would rise up and they would fight the police and everything. And there'd be some white folks or people of different colors that would come in and show solidarity, but it was very rare. And he says, as somebody who lived through that, looking out now at all these young people and just seeing the utter diversity that, more and more white people are waking, especially younger white people, are waking the fuck up to what's going on and actually putting their bodies and time and energy into this fight, which, you can be cynical about that. And there are plenty of reasons to be cynical about white people, and seeing some of the fucking absurd videos that have come out with just white liberal people being white liberals. But at the same time, to hear somebody that's gone through these moments in the past, even the 92 uprising in LA, which was, predominantly black-led, and there wasn't a lot of interracial support. There's even contradictions between the Korean community and the black community, for example. A lot of those are disappearing with time, and as this younger generation comes up, it's a multiracial coalition of people saying enough's enough, realizing that everybody's freedom is tied up with everybody else's. And that should also be another strain of hope, another strain that can give us some optimism. The demographics are shifting. White people are waking up as slow as it fucking takes. My God, how many more centuries do white people need to wake the fuck up? But finally, a sizable portion is waking up. And, this system can't go on forever. And so while this might not be the revolutionary moment, while it might be in 10 years or 20 years, this is a step in that direction, and a drawing of lines saying no more. And the police and the institutions will fight back. But the people are obviously ready to continue to fight back too. And the next time this happens, people aren't just going to accept it anymore. And that's an important change in the psychology of millions of Americans as well. So again, there are reasons to be optimistic, and there's an idea of revolutionary optimism that while we all feel waves of pessimism, and we can look out at a certain point in time and say, fuck, I really thought this was going to be the thing, and then I see this terrible thing happen, and god damn it, nothing's going to fucking work out, fuck everything. That is a self-defeating, counterproductive thing to do, particularly when you're being public about it. So I'd also urge people, Marxists, people that are principled on the left, even if you do feel moments of despair and pessimism, to not be vocal about them, and instead find ways to be constructively optimistic while also being a realist at what's happening. And I think that's an important part too. You don't want to be a reason why people are demoralized. You don't want to add to the demoralization. You don't need to feed into that. Feed into the better part of it. Feed into revolutionary optimism and continue fighting. That's all we can do.
Yeah, I don't know if there's much more I can say after that, honestly. I think that's a pretty good note to end on.
Wonderful. You want to take us out for this episode and remind people of what we're reading next month?
Yeah, definitely. So thank you all for tuning in so much. Hopefully this discussion, has been helpful. And as always, we'd be really interested and happy to hear your thoughts about things as well. Things are developing so quickly. I'm really glad that we switched to this, doing theory one month and then doing current events the other month, because there's so much to talk about in the current events. And hopefully, as you've seen in this episode, we're bringing theory into that too, right? This conversation has drawn on concepts that we've talked about in our previous episodes. And if you haven't listened to those, go check them out. The discussion of spontaneity, especially in our episode on what is to be done, you can get some of the grounding on what we're drawing on. And I hope that we're just able to be connecting the theoretical works that we're looking at even more to the present conditions by doing these episodes as well. So next month, we'll be back on doing a theoretical text, and we're going to do the Communist Manifesto, which will be interesting. It is maybe the most famous communist text. It is also maybe one of the most misread and misunderstood in terms of its importance. So hopefully we can do some work with that and help, elucidate some of the usefulness of that text, its historical historical context and why it matters. So we'll be doing that next month. Hopefully you will tune in for that and you will find that helpful as well. As always, a huge thank you to all of our patrons who have been supporting us, especially during this pandemic at a time when people are really struggling to get by. It helps us to be able to devote the amount of time that we devote to this show, and to be able to put in the work to making sure that we are giving you a podcast that is worth your time and worth listening to and worth your support. So thank you so much for that. If you are interested in finding us on Patreon, you can search for Red Menace and we'll come up. You get bonus episodes where we talk about extra events. We do Q&A sort of things. We've talked about movies and films before. We interact with people in various different ways. We've done some live stream Q&As. There's a whole source of different approaches that we've used in the past. So if that interests you, go ahead and check us out. But as always, just thank you so much for listening. It means so much that we have people who care about what we have to say and who are interested in it, and we hope that it's provided some clarity for you. So stay safe out there, keep fighting, and keep struggling, and as always, in solidarity.